Well, welcome everybody to the second night of our Values Emphasis Week celebration. Tonight we have a wonderful friend of Northwood, a past educator, and we're happy to have him back in here. And I'm going to just take a couple minutes to talk about the history of Values Emphasis Week before I introduce Dr. Priddy, who will introduce our guest of honor tonight. Values Emphasis Week was actually started in 1979, and it was formed out of a partnership between Northwood University and the Memorial Presbyterian Church. And it was a time where Northwood and the community, faculty, staff, students would celebrate what has become our Code of Ethics. And we would revisit that just like we are this week and try to internalize that Code of Ethics. And because in that Code of Ethics, it's a behavior pattern. It's behaviors that we can use in our everyday life when we're students, when we're out of school, and it's a way for us to make a difference in the world around us. What are our Code of Ethics? Well, the acronym is FRESH AIR. We've just changed that recently. It's FRESH AIR. So F for freedom, R for respect, E for empathy, S for spirituality, H for honesty, A for achievement, I for integrity, and R for responsibility. That's our Code of Ethics. Small list of words, very large personal responsibility. But if lived with those behaviors in our pattern, can make a huge difference in our world. So now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Priddy and have him introduce our guest of honor for tonight.
Well, thank you, Dean Kripe, and it's exciting to have us reinvigorate our Values Emphasis Week, and I want to thank Dean Kripe for his leadership in moving this program forward in very important ways across our campus, across our university. We are so honored and blessed this evening to have a real son of Northwood University back home again to share his thoughts with us tonight. Larry Reed, as you all know, I'm sure, is the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and they're headquartered down in Atlanta, Georgia. But his trip, his life, his work has taken him literally all over the globe. If I've got it right, it's something like 81 countries and 6 different continents that he has traveled to in his lifetime. Many of those places giving guest lectures on the important elements of the Northwood idea, things like freedom, particularly economic freedom and responsibility and free enterprise and entrepreneurship. Larry is a renowned and highly, highly thought of guest lecturer. He's a columnist. He is in the media all over the world, has done over 1,000 different articles for different publications, has co-authored a number of different books, including was the editor for a couple of editions of When We Are Free, our own textbook right here on the Northwood campus that we continue to use to this day. He received his undergraduate degree in economics from Grove City College in his home state of Pennsylvania, and then stayed in Pennsylvania and finished his master's in history at Slippery Rock State University. And we had the good fortune to attract him here in 1977 to become a member of our economics faculty at Northwood. And he had a very productive number of years here as a faculty member and as the department chair in economics. In fact, it's my understanding that Larry led the efforts that today have the dual major in economics and management on this campus. And he was the founder of the Freedom Seminar that will come up next month, and is a long-time tradition that has brought incredible speakers from across the globe to share with our students in a condensed weekend format for credit that has made a a real difference across our university. I first met Larry Reed when he was running for Congress back in 1982, and I came here to Midland, Michigan to support his campaign, and brought a PAC check from a little oil company that I was working for in those days that really appreciated free markets and free enterprise, and there was a great contrast between Larry and his opposition in that congressional race. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, he did not win that congressional race, but that allowed him to stay here and educate a generation of Northwood students. It allowed him to go on and lead an important think tank out in the state of Idaho, and in 1987, it brought him right back here to Midland, Michigan, where he was involved with the founding of the Mackinac Center, which is such a core institution here in our community and such an important organization for our state and for public policy across the country. Larry led the Mackinac Center for over 20 years and took his current position with the Foundation for Economic Education in 2008. So please give a very warm Northwood welcome to a real son of Northwood University, Larry Reed. Larry?
Thank you, President Priddy, Dean Kripe, ladies and gentlemen, Northwood students. I know it's customary for a speaker to, on almost every occasion wherever he's at, to start by saying, I'm thrilled to be here, but I mean that more than you can know. Because when I graduated with my master's degree, I had really nothing to show in my life other than a dedication to liberty, and I had no experience really to speak of, but Northwood gave me my first shot at teaching, and it was what launched my career for me, and I'll forever be grateful and have just endless great memories. We were reminiscing today with some folks, and I don't recall whether it was the dedication of this building or the groundbreaking, but it was something going on here way back in the 70s when I was here for my interview. And it happened to be the day when that ceremony was going on, so I joined in and we were part of that. I just can't remember exactly what it was, but it was in connection with this building 38 years ago. And then I started teaching here in the fall of that year. It's hard to believe it's been so many years. Well, tonight I want to talk to you about liberty and character. Liberty and character, and what the connection is between those two things. And if you go away tonight with nothing else, I hope it will be seared into your memory that those two things, liberty and character, are two sides of the same coin. They aren't two different things, really. They are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. That's my core message tonight. I speak to a lot of audiences where I feel I have to actually go into some detail at first describing what I mean by liberty. But thankfully, this is an audience that I believe I don't really have to do that, because liberty and its message is part of the Northwood idea here. So you have a pretty good idea what liberty is and why it's the way to go if you want a society of free and prosperous people. So I won't belabor that point, but I just want to tell you a word or two about it, and then I'll launch into more on the character side. But by liberty, I don't mean, as a lot of people might say, the right to do anything you want. I mean something a lot more profound than that. I mean an environment in which, as long as you do no harm to the rights or the lives or the property of others, you are free to go about your business, to make your choices, to live where you want, to start a business, to earn profits if the marketplace so rewards you, and a lot of other things. I mean an environment which is governed by things like the rule of law instead of the whims of people in power. I mean things like private enterprise, the ability to start and own a business, to grow it, to reap the rewards of its success, as well as to bear the consequences of poor judgments and failure, and start again. I mean an environment in which you have freedoms of speech and press and assembly, where you can run for office and lose like I did, or win as I didn't do. And basically, you're in charge of your life because government is in its proper place. It's providing a general environment of safety and freedom for you to decide how to live your life. That's what I mean by liberty. I think it's one side of that coin I mentioned, the other side being character, and I want to go into that in a little bit. But I should tell you that when we make the case for liberty, whether it be in the classroom or any place else, you all know that one of the strongest arguments for it is that, well, you should be for liberty and its economic component, which is free enterprise, because that's the system that produces the most stuff. Under liberty, people live better. The standards of living are higher. There are more goods and services and greater choices at lower cost for more people. And that's a strong argument. All you have to do is look around the world, and unless you're blind, you'd have to notice that the freer countries are, the more prosperous they are. The least free are the least prosperous. Compare a North Korea with a South Korea. A North Korea where there is no liberty and where there's frequent famines and constant deprivation. South Korea, same people ethnically, but a much freer economy and a far higher standard of living. That's a powerful argument, but if you make that argument to someone trying to convince them why they should be for liberty, and if that's as far as you go, you may convince them, but then they're vulnerable to the first person who comes along and says, well, yeah, that might be right, but it's not fair, because some people have more than others. And if you just put me in charge, or my friends in the political system, put them in charge, give them lots of power, let them take from some and give to others, well, then they can redistribute things a lot better. But the problem with that is that in no time at all, you go down the path whereby both your liberties and your pocketbook get robbed. So you have to have stronger arguments than just be for liberty because it produces the most stuff. I think another argument that's pretty strong for it is, well, it's what we were made for. Liberty is what is in accordance with our very nature. In fact, ask yourself, what distinguishes human beings? What are their features that stand out? If you had to, from another planet, if you came and you wanted to try to describe to the people back home what these earthlings are like, I think one of the first things you would observe and have to report on is they're all different. They're not robots. Each one is motivated by himself or herself, what comes from within, what he thinks, and what his goals are and his ambitions. No two people who have ever lived on this planet, living or dead at the moment, have been the same. That tells you something about each and every individual life, doesn't it? It tells you that it's really precious. When anybody passes away, we've lost something that is utterly irreplaceable. We haven't just lost one of many. We've lost something that's irreplaceable. We are unique creatures, which suggests very strongly that if people are to be what they were created to be, if you are to be the human that you were created to be, if the individual that you were created to be, you've got to be free. You can't be you if somebody else with political power is telling you at every turn what you can do, stifling your every ambition. Then somebody else is trying to make you more like them or what they think you should be instead of you being yourself. So liberty, I think, speaks volumes simply because it is the way we were created. We were created to exercise our unique individuality. That's a strong argument. But the one that I think is often underemphasized is the one I want to emphasize this evening, and that is the connection between liberty and character. Because I'm firmly convinced that a system of liberty, the political, economic, social arrangement that we refer to as liberty, with rule of law, private property, free enterprise, all those things I've mentioned, and more, that's the only arrangement that requires that we live to high standards of character. It's the only one. And I think that speaks volumes for it. You can be a dirtbag and fit into any other system, any of the isms of the so-called left, like socialism, communism. You could be a dirtbag and you fit in there just fine, because those systems don't require much of you other than keep quiet, cough up your taxes, and go off on some foreign adventure whenever the politicians so decide, whether it makes sense or not. Just don't ruffle anybody's feathers or question authority. Under liberty, though, you're not going to have it if you don't have character. A people as a whole, if they don't, by and large, in great numbers, practice character, they're not going to be free. In fact, looking at the history of the world, I can tell you I know of no exception to this, that no people in all of history, no people who have lost their character kept their liberties. None. In fact, that's usually the way liberty is lost. Character goes first, and then liberty is not far behind. Well, that begs the question, what do I mean by character? We use that term a lot of different ways, don't we? Have you heard anybody say of another person, oh, he's a character, or she's a character? And we usually mean that tongue-in-cheek. There's something about them that's unusual or funny or whatever. That's not the way I mean it tonight. I'm using it in its most positive sense, that character is a cluster of traits, personality traits, you might say, that I think are indispensable to the creation and to the flourishing and the survival of a free society. What are those traits? For the balance of this talk, I want to first share with you a few words about the key character traits that are indispensable to a free society. Then I'm going to walk you through history and talk about individual people who exemplified some of those character traits. These are not in any particular order, but I think you can make a case that honesty is one of the most important traits of a free society, one that a free society cannot do without. Honesty means, of course, keeping your word. Can you imagine a society of people who are constant liars, who think nothing of lying to people, whose word you cannot take, who look at every opportunity to gain personally by deceiving somebody else? I mean, if everybody was like that, what kind of a society would it be like? Could you live in such a society? Nothing could be predictable. You couldn't take anybody's word for anything. It would create such chaos that out of that disorder you would inevitably get a strong man who would ride in on the white horse and beat heads together until he brought order to this disorderly system. A lack of honesty, if it should ever become widespread, I think is poison for a free society. So honesty is critical. You've got to insist that others keep their word, especially if they proclaim that they want to represent you in government or any place else. So honesty is important. Another aspect or character trait, I should say, is intellectual humility. I always put that adjective intellectual in front of humility because I don't mean humility in the sense of, certainly not in the sense of running yourself down or never being willing to share some accomplishment you've made or not being proud of accomplishments you've made. I don't mean that at all. I mean intellectual humility, which is to say, to recognize that as much as you may know, there is still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. Learning is a lifelong, or should be, a lifelong occupation. And as much as you might know after being at it for 50, 60, 70 years, there's still going to be an infinite universe of knowledge out there that you don't yet know. Our foundation was started almost 70 years ago by a man named Leonard Reed, no relation. But he wrote a classic essay, you can find it on our website at fee.org, called I Pencil. And it's a story about, or by a pencil, as if the pencil's doing the talking, and the pencil is walking you through how he came into being, how there were people of a variety of occupations involved, some loggers, some miners, some rubber plantation people, and just on down the list, transportation, what have you. And he ends up concluding that there's not one single person on the planet who by himself, from scratch, without relying at all upon the knowledge of anyone else, there's not a single person on the planet who could make a pencil. That's profound. You think of it as something as simple as a pencil. What do you mean nobody can make one? No one person, because to make one, you'd have to be knowledgeable in all these various fields. And nobody's that smart. Nobody knows everything there is to know about logging and where do you get the graphite and how you put it inside the pencil and where do you get the metal and how you fashion it to put it one end of the pencil and the eraser and all that stuff. It's beyond comprehension for any one person. What does that say about the ability of any one person in the world, if we don't know how to make a pencil by ourselves? What does that say about the ability of any one person to plan an economy? Pretty absurd, isn't it? Pretty preposterous. What you do is you allow free people to go about their business, and a marvelous thing happens called the marketplace, where through prices and the profit motive and the interaction of people, consumers chasing after entrepreneurs and vice versa, the end result is, in a free economy, lots of stuff and the innovation just never ends. It's not because of any mastermind at the top who said, I know everything and I'll get it done. In fact, it's because individuals in a free economy are given the freedom to be themselves, go about their business, and they come together as if by magic to create things as simple as pencils or as complicated as jet airline planes. So humility is important. If you're not humble, can you imagine a society of unhumble people? You'd have several hundred million know-it-alls who run around thinking, oh, I know how to live your life for you. Or, hey, let me tell you how you ought to do this. And let me tell you, there's one city in this country that's full of know-it-alls. Washington. It's full of know-it-alls who at any given moment think, oh, yeah, we can plan the economy. All we got to do is tax this guy, give more money to that guy, and do this and do that. They're always constantly trying to regulate and push around and mandate and decree human activity, which reminds me of something the great French economist Frédéric Bastiat said almost 200 years ago. He said, and now that the legislators and the do-gooders have tried every kind of system they can devise and try to impose it on people, let them now start where they should have begun in the first place, and that is with liberty. Still, great wisdom all these decades later. So, honesty, humility. Another thing is courage. I don't see that freedom or liberty is possible in a society of timid people. At any given time, you can count on lots of people in the world who would be happy to take your freedom from you if only they thought they had the chance, if they thought you'd let them. So people who believe in freedom, and that's been a pretty small percentage of all who have ever lived. Maybe everybody has wanted it, but not many really believed in it or worked for it. People who believe in it have to defend it. They have to stand up and speak out on its behalf, especially when it's under threat. So courage is important. I don't see a free society in a dangerous world surviving with the lack of courage on the part of its people. Responsibility is another character trait that's critical. Responsibility, that means stepping up to the plate and not blaming others for mistakes or poor judgments that maybe you have made. The lack of responsibility, if that were widespread, you know what it would look like? You'd have people in society by the millions all claiming, you owe me a living. I failed at this, but that's not my fault. It's yours. Give me something. Bail me out. I don't think you can have a free society very long under that kind of arrangement. You head right down the path to bankruptcy, national bankruptcy and dependency and political figures controlling your life. So responsibility is important. Self-reliance is another. Optimism is yet another. I don't know that I've told this story to a Northwood audience. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about optimism that some of you know anyway. It was an event that happened to me on the way to campus in February of 1980. It was a very slippery morning here in Midland. I was coming for an 8 o'clock class. And on Main Street, right where Post Street is, not very far from here, I was headed toward campus. A car was coming the other way and wanting to make a left on the Post, and decided at the last second he could swerve and make a left in front of me. And I swerved to miss him and lost control of the car, and it rolled into the ravine, which was deeper then than it is today, and ended up upside down. And I remember as it was rolling how I felt and what I thought. As it was rolling, you'd think you'd be terrified, right? I was incredibly calm, which I, to this day, can't quite explain, but I was very serenely calm about it, and what popped into my head was, I'm going to get a new car out of this, which I did. Optimism is important in life. It carries you through so many bad days. And it's contagious, too. If you're optimistic about the future, if you think that, hey, one person can make a difference, doesn't matter how bad things may be now, we can make them better if good people will rally to what they know to be right, well, then you're going to attract more people to your cause. If you're pessimistic, you're not going to work very hard. You're not going to attract other people to your cause. If you tell them, hey, I want to sign you up for this, but we're going to lose, you're not going to have many people who will come your way. You've got to be optimistic. You've got to tell them we can win this. A small number of people can make a huge difference and have throughout history. Now, having said all that, I want to, as I promised, share with you some stories of people who did make a difference. And I'm going to do this in rather rapid fire, so I'll get through half a dozen or more of them, a few minutes apiece, and still give you time for questions in about 15 minutes or so. I'm going to start chronologically quite a ways back. And I'm guessing that there won't be a hand that it will go up when I ask this question. And I say that only because there never has been one in all the times I've talked about this person, and I didn't know about him until about a year ago. How many have heard of the name Telemachus? Anybody? Telemachus. I'm not surprised. But was that a hand? Okay. Telemachus, a man that almost 1,600 years ago lived in ancient Rome. This was late in the Roman Empire. They had already lost the Republic, the relative freedoms that governed Rome for its first 500 years. They'd lost that before the birth of Christ. So this is 400 years after that. It's the year 404. How many have seen the movie Gladiator? Okay, well, you know something then. Even if you haven't seen that film, you know something of the bloody gladiatorial duels that were held in the Colosseum and other stadiums within the Roman Empire. Well, these were cruel, inhuman, unbelievably awful spectacles set up and paid for publicly for the entertainment of the Roman people, in which thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were killed in these gladiatorial duels. You'd wonder today, how could any people sit by and watch and be entertained by something like this? Well, this had been going on for a long time, even after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. That didn't necessarily mean that people were really practicing it, but that's officially anyway. Christianity was the official religion, but not many, even as late as 404, were living up to its ideals. But one day, it was the 1st of January, in fact, 404 A.D., the Colosseum was packed. It would seat 50,000 people sitting, and then another 10 to 15,000 could line the walkways and stand and watch these awful spectacles. And the Emperor Honorius was there on this particular day to open the games. And right about that moment, Telemachus, who was a relatively unknown monk, shouted at the top of his lungs to try to get people's attention. He said, "In the name of Christ, stop." A few people heard him because there was already apparently a lot of noise in the stadium, and the games began, and the killing began. Telemachus made his way down the stairs to the great pit where these duels were being held. And no one was supposed to do that, but he walked down there right in front of some gladiators doing their thing, and he started shouting that again several times. "In the name of Christ, stop." One of the gladiators apparently just thought, who's this guy? He's not supposed to be here. Just took his sword and stabbed him, killed him on the spot. Now you might say, well, what was that for? What a waste. But there was something about the fervor in which he made that pronouncement and his insistence at great risk at repeating it that touched the conscience of a lot of people. President Reagan in 1984 gave an address to the National Day of Prayer, I think, gathering, and he told this story. But you can, if you type in Telemachus online, you'll see stories about him, including the Reagan speech. In that speech, President Reagan described what happened after the gladiator so callously stabbed Telemachus to death. It touched people's consciences, and in the top row, the first few people got up and walked out silently. And then suddenly others stood up in silence and walked out until the Colosseum was nearly emptied. Honorius, the emperor himself, was so moved by what he saw, he declared that very day that never again would a man kill another for the entertainment of the Roman citizens in the stadiums of Rome. So that one man, courageously, seemingly with futility at first, made a pronouncement that made a huge difference. It wasn't enough, of course, to change the course of history. Rome, in another 75 years, would be taken over, overrun by barbarians. This was very late in its day, and it was a thoroughly corrupt society. But one man probably saved the lives of tens of thousands of others because of his courage. He did not live in vain. Second person actually is multiple people, not any one name. I want to jump ahead to the year 1320 and introduce this by referencing another movie. How many have seen Braveheart? Okay, Mel Gibson. That came out, I don't know, a dozen years ago maybe more. It tells the story of William Wallace, a great Scottish patriot who fought against the English invaders so that Scotland could remain free. And the movie ended in 1305 with Wallace's execution. That's depicted in the movie. What the movie doesn't do is it doesn't pick up from there and tell you what happened thereafter. Wallace, after leading the struggle against the invaders, the brutal invaders from England, led by King John, or King, which one was it? Edward I. Wallace is executed, but the battle against the English invaders continues for another 15 years under the leadership of Robert the Bruce. And in 1320, the Scots, by that point, were pretty successful at getting the English to leave. But they're worried that they might come back. And so Scottish nobles come up with a document that is known to this day as the Declaration of Arbroath. It had remarkable influence on the thinking of America's founders 456 years later when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. You'll see echoes of that first declaration in ours of 1776. This was the first document in recorded history where a people asserted that it was the duty of the sovereign or the king to rule by the consent of the governed. Imagine that. The king has to rule by the consent of the governed, not just by his whim. And furthermore, it was the first time in history where a document also asserted that it was the duty of the governed to get rid of him if he didn't rule by their consent. A revolutionary thought, not only then, but for hundreds of years thereafter. And they ended that famous document with these words. If this doesn't stir you, I don't know what will. They said, "It is not for honors or glory or wealth that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life." 456 years before the Declaration. It is not for honors or glory or wealth that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man gives up except with his life. An important document in the long history of the growth of British liberties that undergird the liberties that we asserted as a people in 1776. Now I want to move ahead and talk about 3 or 4 women. So far, these have been pretty much men. I think the Scottish nobles were all men. Telemachus was a man. Here, let me tell you about one of the earliest female entrepreneurs in American history. Back 150 years ago, her name was Martha Causton, C-O-S-T-O-N. Martha Causton. This woman was in the early 1800s, or almost mid-1800s, 1840s I think it was. She was an inventor. At the time, one of the problems was whenever a ship was in distress, out at sea, but within sight of the shore, it was hard to really get anybody's attention. So there had to be some kind of a signaling device, or as we would say today, a flare, to be developed in order to send up a signal. Martha Causton invented the so-called Causton flare. that dominated that whole business of flares for literally for generations. The company's still around to this day. In her lifetime, the Causton flare saved the lives of, it's estimated, thousands of people. Here's an interesting little postscript, though, to her. She was more than just an inventor. She started the company that marketed the Causton flare. One of her best customers early on was the Navy Department of the U.S. government. Okay, and the Navy, at the start of the Civil War, bought an enormous number of these Causton flares from Martha's company, and she sold them to them at a fixed price. But you know that the government ripped her off. This is the shame of it. She never went broke because she was a good manager. She sold enough flares elsewhere. But she contracted with the Navy Department to sell them thousands of these flares at a price. And then the Navy Department said, I'm sure somebody there thought, hey, you know, we're printing all these paper greenbacks that are going down in value because we're running deficits and paying for this war effort by printing funny money. We'll just wait and pay her later when the dollar is worth a lot less. And so they kept holding off payment. And she'd send letters to the Navy Department, hey, you know, you bought all these flares, you haven't paid me yet. Finally, when the Navy made good and had to pay her, it paid her in nominal terms what it owed her, but not in real terms because the money had declined in value so much. It paid her about 20 cents on the dollar. There's a woman who invents something, starts a business, takes the risks in the service of her country, she sells them these things, and then they later rip her off. And pay her just 20 cents on the dollar. I've always, since I've learned of Martha Causton, I thought she deserves special recognition because she hung on to that company even after her own government stepped on her by cheating her out of what it owed her. Great woman, great business person. How many have heard of Ida Lewis? Ida Lewis in Newport, Rhode Island that name would still ring a bell with people, but not very far elsewhere. But she was known in her day, the latter half of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, as frequently referred to as such, as the bravest woman in America. That's what she was known by, the bravest woman in America. Well, what did she do? She was a lighthouse keeper at Newport, Rhode Island, on the coast there, and ran that lighthouse called the Lime Rock, L-I-M-E, Lime Rock Lighthouse. Now it's renamed, by the way. It's the Ida Lewis Lighthouse. She's the only person that the Lighthouse Service, National Lighthouse Service, has ever honored by naming a lighthouse after that person. She's the only one to this day. She kept that lighthouse going, and what she was most known for was the fact that any time she got wind of somebody in distress, she would jump in her rowboat and row out to whatever distance was required until she saved lives. She saved 36 lives over 40 years, including that of 2 Coast Guard men who were in a small boat and had capsized, and she rowed out. She must have had arms like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Remarkable woman who never really wanted to talk much about it. It was hard to get her to go anywhere to talk about her exploits and her achievements, but because she displayed one of those other traits that we, I think, value highly, and that is humility. She just thought she was doing her job, and she did it well. She saved 36 lives. Here's a woman that you may not know her by name, but I'll bet you, those of you who may be churchgoers, I'll bet you have sung one of her hymns. This woman's name was Fanny Crosby. Some remarkable things about her include the following. By the way, she died 100 years ago last month at the age of 95. She was born in 1820 and died in 1915. For the last 4 or 5 decades of her life, she was known throughout America as the most revered, the most respected woman in the country. Almost everybody knew who she was, revered her. And yet, a century after her death, hardly anybody knows her. She was known for her charitable work. In New York City in the 1870s, when that city was struck with a cholera epidemic and thousands fled the city, she stayed behind and ministered and nursed the sick and contracted cholera herself, but recovered. She was the first woman to address the United States Congress. You'd think if that was all she ever did, that'd be worth remembering, right? That tells you something. She must have done something quite remarkable. Why did she get that invitation? How many people have served as President of the United States. Barack Obama is our 44th, but only 43 have served as president because Grover Cleveland counts twice. So 43 men have served as president. Guess how many Fanny Crosby actually met in person? 21. She came to know, in some cases after they were president, she came to know almost half the men who have ever served as president of the United States. Remarkable testimony. She also holds the record for having written the lyrics to more songs than any other human being ever. Some 9,000 of the songs she wrote were hymns. And if you're a churchgoer, you might recognize To God Be the Glory or Blessed Assurance, still sung widely today. She wrote those hymns. Well, the most remarkable thing about Fanny Crosby is, I haven't told you this yet, she was completely blind from the age of 6 months. Never saw a thing. Never had any memory of what the world looked like. And yet went through life saying, gee, I can't imagine all the things I would have missed had I had sight. Can you imagine that? Talk about looking on the good side of things. When she died in 1915, as I say, she was one of the most highly regarded women in America. Everybody knew her. Everybody knew her as a near saint. Here's a woman who overcame an enormous handicap. And when she spoke to Congress, you know what her message was? Her message was not, hey, I'm handicapped, where's my check? Her message was, hey, we are all called to do the best we can in all that we do, in spite of whatever handicaps we face, and thereby be an example for those around us. Well, that's a very uplifting message, isn't it? A great woman who deserves to be remembered. I want to tell you about a young lady, not much older than any of you folks, 21, Sophie Scholl, S-C-H-O-L-L. I highly recommend a film by that very name, Sophie, S-O-P-H-I-E, Scholl, S-C-H-O-L-L. One of those movies where you have to read the subtitles in English because the movie's in German. And I thought when I popped it into my DVD player that, oh, I don't know if I'm going to get through this, having to read it. But you quickly forget that. You're drawn into this immensely powerful movie with top-of-the-line production values, great acting, and a true story. They were faithful to what happened. Sophie Scholl, in 1942, was a 20-year-old student at the University of Berlin. This is at the height of Adolf Hitler's regime in Nazi Germany, where he seemed to be dominating the world. The war had just begun maybe to turn against him in 1942, by the end of 42. He was on top of the world, you might say, and of course suppressing any indication of difference of opinion or dissent within Germany. Sophie Scholl and her older brother Hans were both students at the University of Berlin. They had consciences. They had a good sense for what was going on. A lot of people did, but few had the courage, as Hans and Sophie did, to rise up and try to do something about it. So at enormous risk to themselves, they started not only a printing operation, printing literature that was eloquent in its denunciation of the Nazi regime. They were doing this at enormous risk and networking with other students who were helping them distribute this stuff all over Berlin. The Gestapo was going bananas trying to find out where's all this stuff coming from, who's behind this. In the movie, there's that great moment that actually happened where she and Hans and some other students had just printed up stacks and stacks of this stuff denouncing Nazism and its suppression of liberty and its treatment of the Jews and so forth. A beautiful, eloquent indictment of this awful regime. They're running around the main classroom building at the University of Berlin, which is a circular building with classrooms like spokes on a wheel with a big central atrium. And they're on the second floor, and they're putting stacks of this stuff in front of all the closed classroom doors, hoping that when the bell rings and the classes are over, that students come out and they'll start picking this up, and that's how they're going to get the word out. Well, just before the bell rings, they put a big stack of this stuff on the marble railing on the second floor, and Sophie gets the urge, at probably not more than a second's thought. She just decides, instead of just leaving that stuff piled there, hoping people will walk by and take it, she pushes the entire pile of stuff off that, and it just flutters down, fills much of that atrium below. The bell rings, the students come out, they start reading this stuff, the teachers read it, the Gestapo has been watching the campus, so they see it quickly. It leads within the day to the arrest of Hans and Sophie Scholl. That's the 22nd of February, 1943. They had created a whole movement against Hitler called the White Rose Movement. You can read about it. Type that into Google, you'll find the White Rose Movement. It was a pretty extensive network started and run by students to undermine the Hitler regime. The movie depicts the intense interrogation that both of them undergo. That was on the 22nd and the 23rd of February. On the 24th of February, 2 days after their arrest, both were guillotined. And the movie also shows what witnesses attested to later, what Hans's last words were as the blade fell. They went to their deaths believing firmly in their cause, not shrinking from the prospect of death for a moment. As the blade fell, Hans shouted, "Freedom will prevail." Now you might say, well, were they successful? There was a resistance movement to Hitler, but we know in the end it wasn't that did him in. It was the Allies and their military power. So you might say, well, they failed. But to this day, in Germany, among anyone who appreciates and understands liberty, the examples of Hans and Sophie Scholl still ring powerfully. And thank God we have people, and have had people like that throughout history, who will stand for what they know to be right. I was going to tell you more, but I've got to give you time for questions. All right, Justin, do you want me to do the Winton thing, or just go on to questions? I'll do a quick condensation of this last story, and it's about a man who's still living. I know him, and Kendras Road from the Mackinac Center and I and her daughter are going to visit him again in May at the time of, right before his 106th birthday. This guy's 106. I try to visit him every year or two outside of London where he lives, and I always think, well, this might be the last time, and a year later he's still going strong. And he's known and was knighted by the Queen for what he did way back in 1938-39. I'll tell you real quick. Right before the Second World War, when Jewish people knew that they were in harm's way, that this guy, this dictator in Germany named Adolf Hitler, was on the move, they didn't see war coming necessarily around the corner, but he had already gobbled up Austria, part of Czechoslovakia. He was looking for more territory. A lot of Jewish families fled and settled in freezing camps around Prague in Czechoslovakia for the winter of 1938-39. Nicky Winton is a stockbroker in London at the time. He's on vacation, and his friend takes him through these camps, seeing all these families in these terrible freezing conditions, and what do they say to him? He's a perfect stranger. He's walking through these terrible refugee camps. Parents come up to him and say, "Can you take our children?" Can you imagine how desperate someone has to be to plead with a complete stranger to take their children? They know that no country will let them in, so they can't get out, but they at least want their children to get the safety. And here's a stranger, and they say, "Please, take our kids." He could have just said, "Well, what can one person do? I'm supposed to be on vacation. I feel for you. See you later." But he's a man of character. And he immediately saw the need and wrote letters and telegrams to governments all over the world and said, "If I can get at least the children out, will you let them come to your country?"